I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and this is the new Audi S6. Now you might have already watched a couple of S6 reviews on YouTube, perhaps from the UK, but there's a big important difference to the S6 that Audi sent to us here in Australia, and that's that it isn't a diesel. Our version of the S6 is a petrol, no longer a V8 sadly, but under this long bonnet sits the 2.9 litre twin-turbo V6 that you also find in the RS4 and the RS5, and we've really liked the engine in those cars. So on paper, the Australian spec S6 looks like it should be pretty good. Now, sadly, we don't get the S6 wagon, which would be epically cool, but I reckon even this four-door looks pretty stunning, especially in this Audi exclusive shade of Sepang blue over the rotor grey leather interior. And I think you'll probably agree, if you're a subscriber, that's a bit of a Tom spec. I also like the twin 5-spoke wheels. It's just quite a tidy looking Executive Express. And in today's video, we're going to be finding out how the S6 handles Australian roads, but also how this luxury sedan satisfies that dual role that you expect of an Audi S6, in that it has to be a comfortable commuter or a car to take to a country house or something like that, but it also has to be able to stand up to some dynamic driving as well. But first, let's check out this interior, which basically adopts Audi's new cabin design language, for better or for worse, because I know from reading all of the comments that you leave down below, which I really appreciate, that opinions are mixed on this new dual screen setup that Audi have adopted, and that's what the S6 gets. So we have a large, crisp touchscreen here in the center. It's really snappy and easy to use, and you have wireless Apple CarPlay, which is really good. And then we have a second touchscreen down below, which controls your climate functions and, you know, writing in an address for the sat nav and stuff like that. It's certainly a learning curve. It's a bit of an adjustment if you maybe own a previous gen S6 with a rotary controller down here between the seats. On a bumpy road, it's a little more difficult to use this system, but on the whole, it does feel like a modernization and a slight upgrade. But you know, I still prefer, I think, BMW, who give you the choice of using a rotary dial or a touchscreen. Then in front of you, we have a virtual cockpit, which is just brilliant. It puts satellite mapping right there, so it's like you can read the road before it even happens. You can also have in-depth looks at trip data and your multimedia options as well. Now we have Audi's highest grade of leather, standard here in the S6, Valcona leather. You can go for black or this rotor grey, which I actually think comes up quite nicely here in the light. This car also has optional $1,700 optional exposed carbon twill finish, which gives it a slightly sporty edge, but the standard aluminium also looks pretty good. Also standard is the leather package, which adds leather up here to the door tops and the dash. And compared to the standard dash and door trim you get in a normal A6, this is a massive upgrade, and in fact it should be standard across the range, but at least we get it here. Nice steering wheel, aggressively shaped perforations and metal paddle shifters, so that pretty much is the trifecta. And it's just a comfortable, athletic, elegant space. But I do have one or two concerns about quality, and it's mainly around a couple of rattles emanating from the plastics over bumpy Australian roads, but it wasn't too loud. It's also quite practical. We got two cup holders here, an adjustable armrest, wireless phone charging, and decent sized door bins. So up front, it's nice. What about in the second row? Because I'm a firm believer that a car like an S6 has got to have a decent accommodation here in the back. Because while most people that buy an S6 also have a crossover in the garage, Audi says you do want to be able to use these back seats for your colleagues or your children, what have you. So for myself at 6 foot, sitting behind my own driving position, I have more than adequate headroom, another couple of inches, even though we have a porthole sunroof as standard. Legroom's good, tow room is just a tiny bit constricted, but not as bad as other cars in this segment, like the BMW M550i. We also have air vents here in the back. We have two separate climate zones, 4 zones in total for the car, 2 USB ports, and a flip-down armrest with cup holders, and a little flock-lined section here as well, so your stuff doesn't rattle around. Plus that leather extends to the door tops here in the back. So it works well, but I would limit it to 2 people in the back because the hump in the floor is pretty high. As I mentioned, I think it's a bummer that Audi doesn't send us the S6 station wagon, but the RS6 will be coming, and that is wagon only. But here in the S6 sedan, we have a power tailgate, which I always find a little amusing on sedans, but that joke's getting a bit old now. And in here in the boot, it's a good amount of space. It goes back really far. Like, the boot is really large on this car. It's not necessarily that deep, but the aperture is decent. You know, it's pretty easy to lift stuff in and out. Plus we have a little netted section off to the left and controls here to close the boot or lock the car. But we don't want to lock the car. We want to jump into the driver's seat and see what this sports sedan is like from behind the wheel. So what is the new S6 like to drive? Well, it's been a couple of years since Audi Australia offered an S6, and before it left, it used to be powered by a V8, and it's always a bit of a shame to be stepping down in terms of cylinder count, but thankfully that blow is considerably softened by the fact that the Australian spec S6 picks up a really good, downsized, but really good petrol engine in the form of the 2.9 litre twin-turbo V6. That is what makes the current RS4 wagon and RS5 range so good. It's a really characterful, spirited 6-cylinder engine that, you know, gets the job done very well in those smaller cars, and its effect is not diluted all that much here in the, you know, larger and slightly heavier S6. In particular, the engine still sounds good. You know, it's quite a technical sounding V6. It doesn't have some of those gluggy noises that you're used to from this layout. So, you know, if we listen, you get both a raspy note from the engine and then also some crackles and pops and sort of farty effects from the gearbox as well. But in terms of the performance that it dispatches, well, it's good. So if we come to a stop here, I'll just turn onto this country road, open it up. There's a pretty dominant feeling of torque. We have 600 Newton meters in this vehicle, 331 kilowatts of power, and they achieve a 0 to 100 time of 4.5 seconds, which makes the S6 pretty fast in this sort of category of vehicle. And it feels, you know, it feels about that fast off the line, but where it really does its best work is in terms of its in-gear acceleration, where it just has that sort of devastating effect. Overtaking on country roads couldn't be any easier. You know, yeah, it'll do the stoplight drag race, but it's more about the cross-country pace that the S6 is about to layer on that makes it so impressive. And it's also, you know, a hallmark of the broader purpose of this car. It's a touring sedan. If you're gonna, you know, buy an Audi that's dedicated to sort of out and out sporty driving, you'll look at a TTRS or you know, an RS5 coupe or something. This is more about those sort of longer legs, blending really good performance with luxury, and that's kind of that's the feeling that you get from the S6. The engine is definitely there, it can stand up to it, but it's also a comfortable, calm, cross-country vehicle. The suspension is firm but compliant and certainly not too stiff or too crashy, especially if you leave it in comfort or the middle balance setting. The handling is also pretty good. So the steering is, you know, it's fairly light. You can weighten it up artificially with the individual drive mode controls that are operated through the touchscreens, but I prefer it to have a slightly lighter effect. And it's interesting in that you actually get some steering feel in this car. Like if you're turning into a corner and you encounter sort of repeated mid-corner bumps, you actually get a bit of chat back through the rack, which is unusual actually in this class. These sorts of vehicles, the 5 Series, the E-Class, they're usually pretty isolating cars. And so it's nice to be able to turn it on a little bit more in the S6 and know what's happening underneath the vehicle. You can dial up the handling prowess further if you go for the optional dynamic package, which this vehicle has. It's just over 7.5 grand, so it isn't the sort of thing that you agree to without knowing what's going on, but it involves a selection of features that are, you know, impressive in terms of what they're able to add to the S6's agility. So the first is 4-wheel steering, which is very effective and it's very perceptible from behind the wheel. And in fact, you know, your first hour or so driving the S6 hard, you'll do what I did, and that's continually feed in more steering lock than you actually need, because you're getting the opposing effect from the rear axle, which makes the S6 able to turn into corners much more quickly than you would expect. Now, you eventually adjust your driving style to suit that, but what it does in terms of this vehicle's agility, I'm not sure it makes up for in terms of how artificial it can feel. And I certainly know from a back-to-back drive in the A7, which is available with that feature, that I prefer the just standard two-wheel steer. The front-wheel steering, where the rear axle can be left alone to sort of gently feed in torque, because this vehicle has a 60-40 torque split in normal conditions, so you should be able to feel a little bit of push from the rear end. Now, the dynamic package also includes the Quattro Sport diff, which once again is going to increase your traction out of corners and the overall pace of the car, but I would say it maybe just dials out the fun a little bit. So I'd take an S6 as it comes, normal steering and no specific sport differential on the rear axle, just, you know, the normal Quattro system diverting torque a little bit gently rearward. But on the whole, the character the S6 demonstrates is that it's a really fast cross-country tourer. It'll be interesting to see the difference that the RS6 makes when that arrives with its petrol V8. That's going to be much, much faster again. But in normal conditions, and in a country like Australia where speed limits are so pervasive, something like this really feels like about the top end of what you're going to be able to actually use. Like 331 kilowatts of power is a lot. But in a vehicle like this, it feels, you know, appropriate. It feels like a good amount of power. You know, it's the sort of car you'd like to jump into and, you know, do an interstate drive at a good pace. And while you're doing something like that, you'll also be protected by this car's many safety systems. We have high-speed AEB, adaptive cruise control, lane keep assist, which is actually pretty accurate and pretty strong, front cross-traffic alert, rear cross-traffic alert, exit warning on the doors so you can't open them into a path of another car or a cyclist, which is good peace of mind. But additional peace of mind would definitely be found if Audi upgraded their normal warranty to 5 years. So those are our detailed opinions on the 2020 Audi S6 in Australian spec, in 2.9 litre petrol V6 specification, which is pretty cool. I reckon you'll agree that this is a handsome sports sedan that offers a really nice alternative in a sea of crossovers, and it's cool to see Audi and the other German manufacturers continuing to commit to fast four doors rather than taking the easy route and just building more and more SUVs. I also think that it's a very complete car, and even though it's an expensive vehicle, the amount of standard kit on offer and the amount of performance means there's relative value for money here. Now, let me know what you think about the S6 down below this video. While you're there, make sure to hit subscribe and the notification bell. And as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.